Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of the European Journalism Institute, our virtual seminar. I want to thank everybody for joining us for day 3. For those of you who have been with us from the beginning for the first 2 panels, thank you for sticking with us. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of the European Journalism Institute, our virtual seminar. I want to thank everybody for joining us for day 3. For those of you who have been with us from the beginning for the first 2 panels, thank you for sticking with us. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. We're really thrilled that you could be here. And we're really excited about today's topic, the topic of reporting on religion. So my name is Joe Stars. I'm Director of U.S. Programs here at the Fund for American Studies in Washington, D.C. And I want to tell you a little bit about the Fund for American Studies, or TFAS in short, but then also to talk a little bit about our partners in this seminar this week, the Media Project. So TFAS is an organization, a nonprofit that we offer transformational programs that teach the principles of limited government, free market economics, and honorable leadership to students and young professionals in America and around the world. In addition to the European Journalism Institute, a number of our other TFAS programs are geared towards young professionals pursuing careers in the field of journalism and media, including, and this will be of interest to almost everybody here, the Joseph Reagan Memorial Fellowship for Excellence in Journalism, which provides a 9-month internship with the Wall Street Journal's editorial team. And also we have another program, the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program, which supports a rising generation of serious and enterprising journalists with funding to pursue projects they otherwise would be unable to research and report. We also offer undergraduates the opportunity to study journalism and communications for 8 weeks through our track here in DC, our summer internship program. We're right in the middle of it right now. We have 300 students here in Washington, DC, interning and taking classes and doing all the things I mentioned. A quick plug for our partners in the seminar you've all been participating in. So we're TFAS partners with the Media Project, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering journalists worldwide to provide a more profound understanding of religion and public life. The Media Project hosts 5 training programs around the world each year and a robust communications network with its members worldwide. The Media Project is also the parent organization of ReligionUnplugged.com, an award-winning nonprofit news outlet and online magazine. So once again, welcome everybody. I hope we're ready to jump into the topic. And I was telling our panelists at the beginning of, before we jumped on, that I've always told young people that covering religion, the religion beat, if you will, is so exciting, so cool. But even if you're not covering on the religion beat, including religion in your stories, keeping that in the top of your mind, knowing how to be sensitive about religious issues, not being afraid to bring in religion to a story. It encompasses so many things. And so we want this to be a discussion. And so we'll start with introducing our panelists for today. And then we'll hear from each of them. So I want to first welcome Ibrahim Al-Marashi from Cal State University. Also joining us is my good friend Julie Asher from the Catholic News Service, and Megan Clark is joining us from New York City, the Big Apple, and she is with Religion Unplugged. So thank you, all 3 of you, for joining us today. And I'll start with each of you and ask you to tell our participants today a little bit about yourselves, and then Ibrahim, you will jump into it. So Ibrahim, tell our audience today just a little bit about yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ibrahim Al-Marashi. I'm a professor of history as well as communication. In terms of the European Journalism Institute, usually I give the module on religion and journalism. And in terms of media work, I teach courses on the history of communication. A lot of it deals with using journalism as a first draft of history, and I'm a regular contributor for Al Jazeera with occasional op-eds in the Washington Post, one in the New York Times, and some other Middle Eastern outlets.
Thank you. Megan.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be here. I'm the managing editor for Religion Unplugged, which you may have heard about in the other sessions. We're funded by the Media Project. We launched in 2019. We're a global religion magazine, and we really focus on helping young journalists write about religion and also learn from more veteran reporters. So we can talk more about that later.
Thank you. Julie.
Okay, hello, everybody. Thanks for having me as part of this. I'm the national editor at Catholic News Service. We're an international news service for Catholic publications, websites, and other media outlets. Our main office is here in Washington. We have a Rome bureau, fully staffed Rome bureau with 5 or 6 people. We have a full staff here in Washington, 5 or 6 national editors on the national side, and we have an international editor as well, and she covers the world beyond Rome with a number of international stringers. And basically, we're providing a daily news service of stories, news, features, photos to our clients, like an AP news service would. We also provide other things. We have a group of columnists who do regular columns, and we have something else that we provide, which is not in the news side, but it's called Faith Alive, which every week takes a topic and looks at it from a religious education aspect. And like, for example, this last week, we had 2 or 3 people writing about Dante and Dante's Inferno and that sort of thing. So as national editor, I assign stories, I edit stories, and work with the interns when we have interns during the summer. So that's
Great. Thank you, Julie. Ibrahim, we will start off with you to get some sort of your general thoughts and ideas on this topic. So Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Very good. And it's a good chance for me to take you across time and distance. If you are a potential student thinking of enrolling in EGI, or if you are a more mature student, in other words, have graduated but want to be a student again, I wanted to show you what I would do in my EGI seminar. So more or less what you're seeing here was a abridged version of the readings I would have assigned because I was praying that the EGI would be in person this summer. Nevertheless, what this lecture combines is our virtual seminar from last year, where I talked about specifically the role of journalism covering pandemics. Specifically, the role of journalism covering pandemics, COVID-19, but also journalists in the past, going as far back as the 1918 Spanish flu. So what this is an overview, kind of a guided reading list of what I assign for the students on this particular subject, faith, journalism, and COVID-19, in 5 articles, assuming that next year, hopefully our students will be coming to Europe. They don't want to have too many readings, so I'll try to summarize it in 5 articles. Of course, besides the 5 articles, what I assign to the students is reporting on religion, a primer on journalism's best beat. Now, let's look at 4, 5, and 6 and think how those 3 numbers have been transformed as a result of the pandemic, because of course the primer was written prior to COVID-19. Okay. So what are what do journalists report about beliefs that cannot be proved, particularly during a pandemic? Two things come to mind, and this is what I'll be discussing. Of course, during a pandemic, the role of faith and death and mortality and religious rights, particularly, and it's a macabre subject to be talking about, burials. And then, of course, the role of what happens to the faith community as a result of lockdowns and pandemics. And then finally, how do pandemics test people resolves? Okay. Interviews, of course, are still the ability to do, of course, face-to-face interviews has been severely hindered by the pandemic, but still that's something that technology could be overcoming. And with number 6, look at this. Really, if this primer gets updated now, this is going to be what here we never added was pandemics, terrorism attacks in the name of faith, hate crimes, court legislation, and the role of, we should be talking about mental and physical health and faith. That's what I think needs to be updated. So let me tell you, I've already taught since March 2020 a general course on the history of pandemics, and then another course on the relationship of media and pandemics. So just general, how does the religious beat cut across other journalist beats? Okay, as of March 2020, most journalism, what happens, a pandemic is an independent variable. It happens naturally and affects various human societies. And these human societies are divided into sectors. As of March 2020, most journalists were covering the health sector. The health sector, when the disease was located just in China, of course, much more difficult, but when the disease hit Italy, most media was covering how the pandemic was affecting the Italian health sector, the nurses, the hospitals, the doctors. So that's it. The health sector gets sets the agenda, so to speak. The security sector is another important factor that we tend to forget during pandemics, the mobilization of the military. Think of all the coverage of all those NATO flights crisscrossing over Europe. How many pictures we've seen of the US military being mobilized. Think of the USS Mercy going into New York Harbor, or Russian military aircraft bringing military supplies. Okay, that's covering the security sector. And then we have the spiritual sector. Okay. And that's where the journalists who cover kind of specify in religious matters, that's where they come in. Okay. But then if we zoom in, remember the fourth estate, and that's why I call it so-called the information sector, the journalists and particularly the photojournalists. And that's where they come in. Okay. Number 4 covers 1, 2, and 3. Of course, and this is kind of what I would say, having collected maybe thousands of articles since March 2020, this is where I see the priorities is 1, 2, and 3. So what are the articles I recommend? So what I did was to take 5 articles from each, from the various media. Francis K. Roca's article deals with when the pandemic was a day old. The pandemic had been declared just a day earlier by the WHO, particularly focusing on Italy, when at that time it was an Italian epidemic, okay, where it was particularly focused there, the relationship between Italian priests and providing solace for a country that was overwhelmed. Then I go on to 2 articles that look at the practice of burials. Alyssa J. Rubin is a veteran Iraq reporter. And then Philip Morris is a science journalist, but goes into the realm of religion. And here again, we talk about the overlapping in this National Geographic article. Then, of course, we always have journalists looking for history lessons to understand the present. And now we're getting close to Christmas. It's December 3rd, 2020. And then finally, Elizabeth Diaz is one of a veteran New York Times religion article. And this article, I chose it because it's not specifically about religion. It's kind of about a secular, or I should say kind of a temporal transition, how we survive winter, a few days before the winter solstice. But what I found interesting was how kind of a religion reporter can kind of zoom out and kind of give a big picture before the year of 2020 comes to an end. So let's begin at this church in Milan, a church that I've been to, and this is just a screenshot of the Wall Street Journal article. But what it particularly deals with are those kind of final moments between death and, of course, being for a patient, it's their concern about the afterlife. So here I'm kind of telling a story of the pandemic. Specifically dealing with number 3, the spiritual sector. And Sean Gallup, of course, gave a very powerful presentation yesterday about the role of photojournalism. And this is something we also have to acknowledge, is where are these pictures coming from? And if we talk about, let's say, Francis Rocco, the author of this article, and what can we say are, of course, challenges of doing the religion beat? Well, what is the challenge is the photojournalist actually has to go out during a pandemic, if not the journalist, him or herself. So that's the first challenge, of course, is covering matters of faith, but of course, also risking yourself being exposed to the virus. I mean, if you look at Sean Gallup's pictures yesterday of him going to the hospitals, that was a very good case in point. And one thing I noticed about this, if I take this, or why I chose this article as a particular example, is an example of religious literacy, in the sense that this is not just an article of covering Italian priests, even though the journalist is based in Italy. But if you look at sentence number 2, the grand sweep of how this pandemic is affecting other religions. And I think this is what's fascinating about, fascinating, surreal, and macabre about the pandemic, was not only did this pandemic affect people across borders, but people across faiths. And so here we see, and of course, my particular other area where I teach is not just religion, but history of religion from a comparative perspective. What I noticed in the large survey of articles I collected was a religious interfaith literacy, if I could say so, or kind of, even though you're based in Italy, you're here, look at this reporting on Mecca, observances in Israel, the Church of England, the Methodist Church. This is one great theme that I've noticed. And again, where I talk about here is just a good example of what happens when the health sector, once the person is deceased, we tend to forget this is a job that's very important for the security sector during pandemics. It's usually the Italian or any country's security forces, police, military in most cases, usually take care of the very delicate and dangerous job of burying the deceased. What about a country that doesn't have a cohesive security sector or military? Who takes care of burials in Iraq, for example? That's the topic of Alyssa Rubin's article. In this case, it's the Iraqi Shia militias. The same militias that a couple of years were fighting ISIS have now become the pandemic burial force. This is one of the largest cemeteries in the world. It's a house next to a shrine in Najaf, Iraq. That is basically the equivalent of what is Vatican City for the Shia Muslims. And just as an interesting side note, my Christian grandmother is actually buried back in the 50s in this Shia cemetery in Iraq. And again, just to highlight the content of the article, and of course, if you just want to take a screenshot of these articles, and I'll make the PowerPoint available. The article, the pictures I found quite powerful of the very dangerous work that is required for burial. Now, the interesting thing about the Shia militia is, in terms of, again, the subject of interfaith, they bury any Iraqi. Okay? So even if they're Sunni Muslims, the Shia militia will take care of their burial. And even if they're Christians, now Iraq has Armenian Orthodox Christians, it has Catholics. So what this led to was the interesting phenomena, again, the final moments, the Shia militias taking care of the deceased. The fascinating thing is these Iraqi Shia militias have to go online and to find what are Orthodox burial rites, and they will perform them. What are Catholic burial rites, and they will perform them. But the other service they also offer is to allow the families to attend the funeral via Zoom. And so this is just one example that stuck out at me in terms of Alyssa Rubin, who's not a religion journalist per se, or not on the religious beat per se. She covers Iraq, but of course, again, when we're talking about the themes of crossing, the various boundaries in journalism, here is another example. And then Philip Morris's article, this is an entire National Geographic issue devoted to the pandemic in November 2020, but that deals with, again, this kind of transition, the final moments, the crossing over from life and death. And if you just look at these three sentences, very powerful sentences, but this article is particularly about the transformation of faith. Very powerful article, transformation of faith and services during the COVID pandemic, written by a science journalist. So then again, we see the intersection. And then what I found fascinating, if you look at Kristen Rogers' article, is, of course, most of the journalism by journalists about 1918 usually focuses on the US. Kristen Rogers went to Spain and goes, again, here you see what's the other job of the journalist is, of course, conducting interviews. But what I found interesting about this article in Zamora was its similarity to a problem in Iran. Catholicism and Shia Islam have something in common. They both place a heavy emphasis on saint-like figures and relics, and the problem of kissing those relics. It was a problem with the Spanish flu, literally in Spain in 1918. And if you remember the epicenter in Iran, it was the site of the equivalent of a Shia Muslim shrine, and the kind of a similar habit of kissing holy relics that probably exacerbated the outbreak there. And then if we finally conclude with Elizabeth Diaz's article, like I said, she's a primarily a religious writer, but in this case, she zooms out, not particularly focusing on religion per se, but another aspect that I found quite interesting is temporality, the winter solstice. Okay, and in this case, what I find quite interesting, we tend to forget of some of the older traditions, some of the more ancient traditions beyond the Abrahamic triad that usually kind of is the primary focus of, let's say Anglo-American media and most media, I would say, for that example, where she brings in Zoroastrian practices, Chinese faith systems. And this was for the awful year that was 2020. These were 5 pieces that kind of highlighted the tragedy, that were unique and kind of really, with journalism writes the first draft of history. This is what I would pick as writing the first draft of the year 2020 and the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Very interesting. So I wanted to go to Julie Asher next. And Julie, if you want to key off anything Ibrahim said is fine, or your publication's a little bit unique in that you are reporting for Catholic publications, but you're doing straight news, real news. Is there and how does that intersection of how does your publication deal with interfaith issues? What are some of the just general thoughts you have on reporting on religion in general?
Okay, thank you, Joe. Of course, we're a Catholic news service, so we're focused on Catholic issues. And within that, there is so much to be covered, because we cover the internal workings of the Catholic Church, the issues within the church, also the Catholic the individual Catholics and their spirituality, and you also have all these issues like the pandemic. That's a whole, I mean, we covered a lot of that because, as Ibrahim was saying, how it affected a lot of religions' worship services, for example. I mean, for the last year, we've had story after story of how Catholic dioceses have had to accommodate the pandemic restrictions. And within that also were concerns about clamping down on religious freedom, because we had at least two archdioceses, one, the Archdiocese of Washington and the Archdiocese of San Francisco, who, among all these concerns about the pandemic, of which there were many, how do they serve their people just on a spiritual, sacramental level? The Archbishop of San Francisco sued the mayor there, and the Archbishop, Cardinal Gregory, and the Archdiocese sued the mayor of DC because they said that the restrictions placed on churches were more limiting than what they placed on big box stores, for example. And how could shopping be more important than fulfilling your sacramental needs? So there was that aspect of that. There was the aspect of Catholic healthcare workers addressing the health needs of people in Catholic hospitals. And then you had the whole issue of eviction, people losing jobs. How are they going to take care of their family? And the Catholic Church has a network of agencies called Catholic Charities. There's a national network, and then in each diocese, of which there are 176, each diocese or archdiocese has a Catholic Charities agency. So there was all that to cover as well. And those agencies, their motto is, we serve people not because they're Catholic, but because we are Catholic. So you're talking about serving people broadly. You don't have to be Catholic to be helped by Catholic Charities. So that pandemic, which has occupied all of us for the last year and a half, has been a big part of what we've done. But on another level, we have all these other stories to cover, because you have the nice, feature stories. And another way I should interject, another way we cover these things on a local level is we don't have people everywhere, but we rely on the local diocese to cover really great stories locally that have national interest, and then they send them to us, or I can call them and say, what's happening in your diocese? It's a national issue. Are you covering that? Whether it's the death penalty issue. I mean, the range of issues is enormous, and we're just focused on the Catholic Church. But we do focus also on interfaith interaction between Catholics and all manner of religions, because of the Catholic bishops have dialogues with the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, Buddhists. I mean, they have a range of what they call dialogues, which are actual people coming together around a table to discuss issues as to where they agree on certain things, where they don't agree, and how they can come up with a statement together on some issue or not. And then we cover, when there was the tragedy, the horrible tragedy in Pittsburgh at that synagogue. That, of course, would be a story for us as well, because that's affecting people of faith. But you also have the Catholic community reaching out to that synagogue and that community, and that's a story for us as well. So I guess to sum it up is, we cover the Catholic Church, the issues within the church, the things that make news, what the Pope is doing. That's what our Rome Bureau is for. But then you have all the issues on the ground of Catholics in the pew, Catholics struggling with homelessness or whatever, or Catholic agencies helping the homeless. So it's really quite a range of issues that we cover as a Catholic news agency. And as far as how it intersects with other news beats, I would say education is a big one. There is Catholic education, obviously. You've got Catholic schools, elementary, high school, so many Catholic universities, but there are wider education issues. To cover that, we would talk to some Catholic experts on education at those Catholic universities. We also have the issue of immigration. I mean, the whole gamut of issues. Business-related issues we might cover and get a Catholic perspective from, say, the Catholic University's business school, on capitalism. What's the big debate now about capitalism? that sort of thing. So, you know, it intersects in many different ways, but you have to be aware of all that stuff here at Catholic News Service. Even though our folks aren't business writers, they ought to be able to write a story getting a Catholic opinion, a Catholic angle on just about any topic. So I guess in a way we're specialists, but also generalists, because if you have a number of issues that aren't specifically Catholic, we're going to get a Catholic angle on it if we think it's of interest and importance to the Catholic audience that we're serving. So.
Thank you, Julie. So Megan, your publication, Religion Unplugged, suggests maybe a different approach perhaps to reporting on religion. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your publication and some of your thoughts on why you think Religion Unplugged is needed today?
Yeah, so Religion Unplugged is a little different than some of the other religion outlets out there because we don't focus on just one religion. That's the biggest difference. So we're covering all faiths globally. We're interested mainly in religion and public life. So the intersection of religion and politics, religion and culture. We're interested in more long-form features, not just breaking news. Like we have a lot of competitors that do a lot of breaking news, like wire services. And we're also different because we work with a lot of younger journalists, and we're a place for that. So those are some of the ways. So hopefully some of the people listening here may come to us later with ideas. Feel free to pitch me. But my job is assigning, editing almost all of our stories, and then helping promote them on online, you know, to grow our audience. We have a podcast, we have 2 weekly newsletters, and we have our social media pages. But I thought that I would start out my introduction talking a little bit about my background, because hopefully people can relate to that of why I even got into religion journalism, because I never thought that I would. But a little background is that I grew up in Texas. So I grew up Southern Baptist, and I didn't just grow up culturally Christian. I spent many hours at church and in charity activities with my church community. Religion has always been a huge part of my life, central foundation of my decision making, and even in my decision to go into journalism. So I didn't think that would mean writing about religion, but initially I was reporting on the business beat. And then I left that job to go to India because I wanted to cover human rights. So I began writing for these NGOs, interviewing survivors of labor trafficking, modern day slavery. I worked on rape and child sexual abuse cases. And then I began freelancing in India. And writing from India is really when I started thinking about religion journalism, because not even consciously, I realized that almost every story I was writing had to do with religion. And it was really a revelation to me, because I was writing about things like discrimination and violence against Muslims in India, changes in laws dealing with Muslim refugees in India or African Muslims in India, things like protests for gender equality in Hindu temples, even small things like I wrote about a new play opening that happened to be a story about Esther, and she was a Persian Jew, and there were a lot of Persian Jewish people in India at one time. And so it was relating that whole story. So just in all these surprising ways I didn't even look for, these stories were coming to me, and I was thinking like, wow, religion is a really big deal. And I think maybe in the US we miss that more than in other countries for whatever reason. And so that whole experience helped me see that maybe I could contribute to the religion beat by understanding the importance of religion in everyday people's lives. You know, the US is also one of the most religious countries. We still have a lot of people attending religious services compared to Europe, for example. And so just being familiar with not just evangelicals like the community I grew up in, but the whole range of religions, just out of my personal interests and my own spiritual journey that has gone to many different places. So that's how I got into it. And I think that reporting on religion involves understanding what motivates and drives people of faith. So for me, that's the most interesting part, is that it's getting behind a lot of the facts into the why, and the why of the stories and the why not, and understanding worldviews and how people's beliefs are shaping these ideologies that we're seeing. And it shapes their views on gender, on racial justice, on individualism, on LGBTQ issues, and basically every culture issue that makes it on the front page of our newspapers. There's a religion component to a lot of it. So that's why I think it's interesting. So I think for anyone that is interested in getting into the religion beat or understanding religion better in the news, I have a list of advice and tools and things. I don't want to get too ahead of the Q&A, but one thing I see a lot is that when we get pitches, sometimes the pitches aren't clear enough. They really need to be very succinct, or maybe people haven't done their research first to see what's covered and really understand the history of religious traditions. That's really important. I think some people miss that. But even just attending religious services and spending time in a community aside from interviews, and letting people know that you're interested in their community, not just for the journalism you want to extract from it, just personally showing more interest, and also asking people in a community, in a religious community, what they think the media is missing and not covering well, because they probably have a lot of things that they feel the media is stereotyping about them, having a cliche narrative, not really understanding. So I think that's a great starting point. And then I could go over a little bit of maybe some examples of stories that we've done in Religion Unplugged, or great themes and stories I've seen in 2021. Obviously, there was the US election and the aftermath. We have a global audience, but those stories still did the best for us because people were interested in what's going on in the US, and like, what are US evangelicals? What is this deal with them supporting Trump? All those questions. So one of our most viral stories was on Pentecostal Christians or charismatic Christians who, they're frequently into prophecies and hearing directly from God and sharing those revelations. And so some of these Pentecostal leaders had predicted that Trump would win the election. And then we did a later follow-up story by one of our veteran reporters, Julia Dean, did this story really well. And she's really on the Pentecostal beat. But she followed it up with this story about the split among Pentecostals happening as some apologized after they realized that they were wrong, Trump was not elected again. And they were so sure that they heard from God that he would be reelected. So on the one hand, some were apologizing, trying to save their credibility to their community and not be a false prophet. And then on the other hand, some were really digging in their heels and insisting that the election was stolen, that they were right, that Trump did win. So we interviewed a lot of people and did those stories. And then of course, there was the Capitol riot where some people were holding Christian symbols as they broke into the Capitol building. And then other Christians responded in shock and horror and concern of, trying to fight any harmful signs of nationalism in their own congregations. And there's still a lot of debate about that. One recent story that I did this spring was about a Bible that actually has America's founding documents in its pages. And we had gotten a tip from someone. I got a tip from a very concerned pastor on Twitter who said, this Bible is coming out, and the guy who created it says that HarperCollins, which is a big Christian publisher, is in discussion to come out with this Bible. And so I followed up on it, and they were under discussion to print that. He had a sample of the Bible, and he was going to release it on 9/11. He still is, but with a different translation, because after we did the story, there was an online petition launched. It really went viral, and it turns out HarperCollins did not want to be involved. They basically said, we weren't going to do this, even though they had produced a sample. They backed out. And now this guy producing this Bible is going with Creative Commons King James translation instead. So those are some of the kinds of stories we cover. Other big themes, obviously, are racial reconciliation, the social justice movements. We were the first to report on George Floyd's involvement in a ministry in Houston, where he lived before he went to Minneapolis. And then big stories to follow: LGBTQ rights versus religious freedom. We see that all the time. So anyway, hopefully everyone knows that it's very clear religion stories are everywhere and so many different beats. So always leave that for more questions.
Sure. Thank you, Megan. So I do want to open the floor to questions, so please use the Q&A box there. But Megan, you've touched on this, and Julian Ibrahim as well, but I was hoping you guys could expand on religious literacy. Obviously, there's Google. If you don't know something, you can Google something about a particular religion. But what would you say to a journalist who wants to be more religiously literate or sensitive? Is it a mindset? I know Megan mentioned going to services. What would the three of you suggest to for a reporter who just wants to be better at this? Ibrahim, you want to go?
I get that after the end of every one of my modules. So there is one book I recommend. It's written by an Anglican pastor, if I'm not mistaken. It's A Little History of Religion. And it's an entire series, I believe, published by Princeton University Press. But that's usually the first I go to. Where, I could have an Anglican, the author, I think, for the religion I know most intimately, does a better job of expressing the inherent nature of Islam than I could. So that would be the first. The second would be see how, if you could find it in English, how do media, let's say Al Jazeera, perfect example, right in English, how do they cover Islam? And, just read what the English media, if you can find it, is how do they cover religion in their local context? So, of course, for me as the professor, it's always reading. And of course, if I'm thinking in the age of COVID-19, it's hard to now recommend, going to other, religious institutions or practices. But so that's the first two things that come to my mind.
I would say my advice is, number one, to follow top religion journalists on Twitter and follow top religious commentators. You just want to absorb all of their hot takes on the news because they have many, and they often point out mistakes or mischaracterizations. And as much as everyone hates Twitter, it's also like, if you're a journalist, you should love Twitter because there's so much good information on there. And then also I would suggest, there's plenty of online crash courses as well. I'm going to Harvard Divinity School in the fall, and they have a really great world religions and religion in public life curriculum. There's stuff like Harvard X, that's a few $100s. Maybe your work can sponsor it even, but it's a really big course that you get for that, to learn about world religions through their own scriptures and perspectives. And then you probably just need to choose a specialty and not try to cover everything if you can, and try to learn a lot about one particular group or one broad category, like Protestants in America, and start asking really invasive questions of people at dinner parties, like bring up politics and religion everywhere you go and just ask people what they think.
Megan, I'm sorry to just interrupt, but that also represents the generational divide. She went for the digital, I went for the old-fashioned. There's an excellent crash course called Religion for Breakfast. And
that's on YouTube, right?
Yes, that's on YouTube. And even very arcane religious matters. I mean, he's quite profound. So as an academic, I would highly recommend that channel.
Julie, any thoughts on that?
I like what Megan and Ibrahim have suggested, but I'm just talking about the Catholic Church specifically, learning more about, as basic as it sounds, I'm going to plug our style book because we have our own style book on religion. And I would suggest, if not this one, but AP has a style book everybody knows about, but every religion obviously uses certain terms and expressions, and a lot of getting religion stories right is to know terms. And as simple as it may sound, there are things in the Catholic Church, even just about, saying Mass, the expression say Mass, not held a Mass, not, had a Mass, things like that. I think people need to know about if you're going to cover Catholic things. And I also am wondering, I know the Catholic Bishops' Conference always had like a media like a media handbook to explain some of these things. And I don't know if other formal religions have that sort of thing for journalists. That might be something to look at for each denomination, but also the Religion Writers Association. I think that's the name of it. They may offer, you don't probably have to be a member of it, but they may offer seminars and talks about covering religion. And you might, that would be a good resource. Now, the Catholic Press has its own trade association called the Catholic Media Association, and they provide a lot of online now virtual conferences and sessions on all aspects of Catholic coverage of various issues. So I guess I would just look widely at what's out there so you understand what each religion, some specifics of each religion, so you can write about it intelligently, obviously. Yeah, Religion News Association, Xander just put that.
I forgot to mention Religion Link, which I think is powered by Religion News Association, if I'm not wrong, but they are a great blog that occasionally, they don't post too often, but they post on topics in the news, and they provide a really great primer and then a huge list of sources that you could call if you're reporting on that topic.
Thank you. So we have a question from Paul Glatter. He's curious to hear from each of you your takes on whether religion is understood / shown enough in new entertainment media platforms such as Netflix, Amazon, and the like. Do you think these platforms and tech overlords seem cautious or nervous, censorious when it comes to religion? You're muting.
Paul, are you talking about entertainment or the documentary?
I think he's talking about the platforms themselves. Not sure.
I can go real quickly. I actually think that Netflix and I can't think of like what other platform, Hulu, these places, they do have a lot of religion related stories or content, but I find that a lot of them are from a perspective that's a little bit anti-traditional religion or anti like lowercase orthodox religion. And I think that's more the problem, is that, conservative, socially conservative religious people have seen this for a long time. That's why they're developing their own platforms as alternatives. So that's the thing I see. And I see a lot of people complaining about, well, I don't know if I want to let my kid on Netflix now because there's so many shows about LGBTQ issues, for example, and they have different values at home. And so they're moving to other platforms.
Netflix. So let's look. Netflix did have its kind of an entire drama series called Messiah, and I think that was his first foray. I found it fascinating, but they didn't sponsor it for a second season. Remember CNN also had a series by Reza Aslan where he interrogated different kind of subaltern religious traditions. And that also wasn't taken on for a second season. So it says something, mainstream media, yeah, religion doesn't apparently garner that much.
I think it's an opportunity for some people though, because there's this series called The Chosen that is wrapping up its second season. And apparently it's the biggest crowd-funded
It's crowdfunded,
operation.
yes.
It's crowd-funded, and I think they raised over $1 million crowdfunding for the first season or something. And it's
Actually,
like
Megan,
wildly popular.
I'm gonna pitch an article comparing Messiah and The Chosen to
Oh,
you.
you should, yeah.
So very, very good way to bring that up. But so there you go. But it says it had to be crowdfunded. That says a lot.
So Michelle is interested in Megan's comments where she thinks the US media may not cover religion stories as well as other countries. And we'd like to hear from all of you if you think that's true and any reason why that might be the case.
Oh yeah, actually, I don't think that the US doesn't cover, I can't remember exactly how she worded that, but I think I was trying to say that the US media seems to spot religion stories better in other countries sometimes than in the US. But I think American journalists, like the religion beat in the US is probably one of the best in the world. Like we cover it pretty well, but there's just a lot to cover.
I wanted to ask each of you, what, in your experience, what are some of the challenges when it comes to, and this sounds like a really basic question, but I think it kind of cuts to the core of why we're even having this panel. But what are some of the challenges that you've experienced covering religion? Because you're talking about, for many people, that which is deepest to them, that, you know, this is their breath. This informs everything for them. You know, the idea of stepping into a minefield, I don't think is probably a pretty good imagery to use sometimes when it comes to covering religious issues. How do you navigate this minefield, and what would you? Again, this goes back to a little bit to religious literacy, but how do you, in your own mind and when advising young people, deal with some of these challenges?
I think that's the key, is going in with some religious literacy. I mean, my two big interests are Catholicism and Shia Islam. And so on one level, it's also cheating because I come from one of the faith traditions and then, you know, went to Catholics. I mean, Shia Muslims also went to Catholic school. So it's, and lived in very Catholic countries. So maybe in my case, it's a bit, I'm cheating, but it's because both these traditions I've lived in it, that I know how to navigate the minefield. I know the minefield, so to speak. I know where the mines are and where not to step.
I have a couple things to add. One thing, I guess this fits under the challenges thing, but it's sort of a general thing about, sadly, the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, which first came to light in 2002. I mean, there's many markers along the way, but I think for a long time, it was very hard for journalists in the Catholic press, let me just say that. Other journalists might have had better luck, but getting Catholic leaders to address the issue honestly and be transparent. I mean, that has been a problem for many years, but it's changed a lot in the last several. And also, I think just from a Catholic news agency perspective, one of the challenges is a lot of people who have a great Catholic story pitch it to a secular news outlet first, you know, and a lot of times we're playing catch up because the New York Times, the Washington Post, whatever has, and I'm not talking about sex abuse, I mean just some other really great story. And so sometimes we get we're second string, I think. And that to me is a challenge because we do our best to say, hey, we're the Catholic News Service, we want to tell that story. And then we end up playing catch up, which doesn't make us look very good. So the challenge is to have people in leadership, just to use it kind of generally, think about if they have a Catholic story, think about the Catholic press. you know, I mean, they get more coverage, I guess, more readership if it's in the secular press, but that's one of our challenges just in general, is to get people to see us as the place to go to for get that first bite of the apple, so to speak, on a story. But that doesn't really address challenges for getting stories from people. Sometimes people are reluctant to tell their story, I guess, about the good news, the good thing that they're doing at the parish level. Oh, well, I just do that, you know, that isn't really a news story. And so I'm not sure the way to break down the wall to get people to tell their story, except to maybe spend time with them and say, hey, I'm interested, or spend time at the food bank yourself. Like Megan mentioned, going to religious services, but maybe it would be neat to volunteer a little bit if you have time at a food bank, and then win over the confidence of those people, and then get them to tell you the story about why they do that, why they're helping people, because those are really great stories, I think.
I just want to encourage our participants to ask questions or even share some of your thoughts. They don't have to come in the form of a question, but I want to ask the three of you the following question. Every journalist has that one or two stories that they look back on and can't believe they got to report on it, or that it's sort of a story that's seared in their mind. What is a story that the three of you have covered in your careers that have a religious component to it? Something that was a story that may have even changed you, or made you look at religion differently or journalism differently. Can any of you, each of you, point to a story or two that might have set you on a different journey? Megan, you talked a little bit about going to India. Are there any stories like that that were pivotal for any of you?
Yeah, I guess I can go first. One of the stories that is most important to me, I guess I would say, like, close to my heart, would be I spent a lot of time in a refugee community of Rohingyas in India, and they're people who fled, they're Muslims who fled Myanmar. They have terrible stories of violence and horrible things that have happened to them, and a lot of them have settled in different camps in India. So I did this story. I think I learned a lot doing it. One of them was just not to listen to authorities sometimes. UN workers who told me not to go there without them and those kinds of things. And in the meantime, some college students from that community who spoke English kept telling me, come back, and they wanted me to come there. And so I went there, and it was kind of a hard area to get to and really not that safe to go to. And because of the reporting that I did, including, women who were dying at home, having children because they didn't have access to healthcare, and the Indian law provided for them to have school and healthcare, but they weren't able to actually access it. So that was the story. And after I wrote it, the UN went there and kind of tried to fix some neglect that had been going on. And that really opened my eyes to these stories of religious discrimination, because it wasn't just a refugee story. India really ignored this problem because they were trying to deport them, and there was a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric coming out of the government. So it was very much a religion story.
Ibrahim or Julie?
I could add to that. Being an editor, most of my work is sitting at my desk editing other people. So I'm not out on assignment, except that I don't know if any of you are aware of the World Youth Day that the Catholic Church puts on every 2 years. It's an international event. And when John Paul II was still Pope, he visited Denver, which happens to be my hometown, but I was here in Washington, but I went to Denver to cover the World Youth Day with John Paul II. And I guess it was quite an experience because you're seeing all these young people just enthusiastic to see a pope. I mean, that they even care about the pope, but huge field of people at the final mass. And it was just very thrilling to see all these people. It kind of restores your faith in young people's faith, and also just to see the pope, because I've not been to Rome. I haven't seen the pope in Rome. And that was just a very exciting thing to follow along with young people, because it was like a pilgrimage thing from one site to the final site, and just follow along and talk to them and actually interview people. I mean, that's one of the neatest things, is I think interviewing people on the street kind of thing. And that was a great experience. And then there was a smaller event that was very limited to the press, and it was a school for at-risk children, and they had a chapel, and the Pope was there, and I was in the choir loft looking down on the Pope and the crowd of young people, of children. And it was very exciting because it was a very small, contained thing, and it was open to few press. So that was an exciting place to be, and actually see the interaction of the Pope with young children talking about all the questions they had for him. And it was an exciting time. And that was a while ago. It was like 1993, but anyway, it still sticks with me.
Ibrahim?
So just like Julie, most of my media experience is op-ed writing. So I'm going to shamelessly send you the link to the op-ed. Writing this op-ed for Al Jazeera on the Pope's visit to Iraq, where it's literally he's visiting Ayatollah Sistani, one of the highest figures in Shia Islam. And of course, one of my relatives is one of the clerics associated with Ayatollah Sistani. So somebody in my family met the current Pope. And that was the most exciting, most historical event I could write about. The most tragic is as a Muslim writing about a shooting at a synagogue in San Diego. And it's because, of course, the common trope is of Muslim-Jewish conflicts or Arab-Israeli conflicts. But this is where I really felt it was something that really had nothing to do with that. That was an attack on my community. And then tragically, so I just gave the link to that Washington Post op-ed. I give a lot of talks at synagogues on this very topic, Muslim-Jewish understanding. And so in other words, I could have been a victim. I mean, of course, the attack took place on Passover, but it's not, it made me realize that not only my Muslim houses of worship are vulnerable to attacks or vandalism, but that even Jewish houses of worship are vulnerable. And I could very much be at one of those as well.
Thank you. So we have a question, a good question from Paul, and then I want to follow up with the next question for Julie, because they're kind of tied in. So Paul says that we see a lot of mainstream media coverage about Pope Francis, whether he's progressive or not, the infighting by factions of cardinals and bishops over issues like LGBTQ, sex and gender. We see it playing out now in stories about whether President Biden should take communion. Does the mainstream media do a good job on these stories, Julie? Or do you see a problematic reporting or framing in these zones?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag, I guess, on the reporting on alleged infighting within the church, bishops who don't like the Pope. Pope says this or that. And sometimes I think the stories are reported through the framework of what the reporter brings to the story. You know, they've already kind of have a preset feeling or opinion on what the Pope doesn't get, or that Catholics are, the conservatives are fighting with the Pope, seen as a liberal. And I don't know, a lot of bishops would say, well, we're neither conservative nor liberal. They're just bringing up issues. So it's a mixed bag. I think sometimes it's sensationalized, these conflicts. And if you want to talk about the Biden communion situation, I found that, and maybe someone said to me it was the bishop's own fault for this, but within the discussion the bishops had at their meeting 2 weeks ago. The issue on the table was, should the bishops develop a document related about communion and the Eucharist in the lives of Catholics? What is the role of the Eucharist in the lives of Catholics? Because a lot of people do not believe in the real presence of Christ in the host. And so the idea was, let's do a document to explain these things. Well, within the conversation, then some bishops said, well, this is really aimed at Joe Biden because he's a Catholic who supports abortion and he goes to communion. But some of the reporting made it sound like the document was already written and it was going to scold Catholic politicians and suggest they not, or say they shouldn't get communion. Well, for one thing, the Catholic Bishops' Conference cannot dictate that to any bishop. And Cardinal Gregory of Washington already said that, he would never deny communion to the president. So I think there was a lot of sensationalism in that reporting because there is no document. And a lot of the stories said there is a document and the bishops voted, yay, let's, deny Biden communion. But it's more complicated than that. And because it is so complicated, you get a boil down and it doesn't really reflect the conversation or what they're trying to do with this document. So.
And another question for you, Julie, from Anonymous. Anonymous found it interesting that you mentioned 2 cases in which lawsuits came out about from COVID restrictions on religious freedoms, especially with sacramental practices. How did your news service balance between sharing their perspective and the objectivity of COVID restrictions?
Well, I guess the news stories we did basically said the civil authorities say in San Francisco, the mayor says, these are the restrictions and here's why. I mean, we just basically said, here's what the city says that should be done. And here's what the Archbishop of San Francisco said should be done. It was just basic reporting on, and we did the same in Washington, the Archdiocese of Washington, because their fight was with the mayor. And it happened in other places, but it basically was just, here's what the civil authorities say, here's what the church says. Here's why they don't like the restrictions. Here's why the civil authorities say there should be restrictions. So I would just say it was straight reporting.
And a question from Paul. He's curious to hear from each of you your take on what the big religion story or trend deserves focus in the next year.
Okay, I'll start since I'm.
Yeah.
Well, people have probably heard a lot about the nuns, and I don't mean religious sisters, I mean N-O-N-E-S, nuns, young people especially, who have no religion. They don't believe in anything religious. And I think it's been covered. It's not a new issue, but I think over time, that should be explored more, because how does any religion, whether it be Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, how are you going to continue if you have so many young people who don't believe in anything? Why should those churches exist even? So to me, that would be one of the biggest stories to be done.
I can go next, I suppose. One thing that I want to focus on this year is the fracturing of American evangelicals based on ideological lines, but also, so many factors. It's really complicated, but one data point that came out today that was kind of surprising from PRRI, which is, I'm forgetting, Public Religion Research Institute, found that the white Christian decline in America actually slowed recently. And this data is from 2013 to 2019. And that now mainline Protestants outnumber white evangelicals. So it looks like what's happening is that some white evangelicals are disidentifying as evangelicals. And so I'm interested in exploring all the reasons why. I figure that some parts of the media may just blame Trump, but I don't think that's accurate. I think a lot of people also disaffiliate based on theology, culture, so many different things going on within big evangelical denominations regarding women as pastors, LGBTQ issues, and even now critical race theory. So that's one thing I'm interested in exploring.
I'm interested, and for those of you coming for EGI 2022, this is going to be another theme I look at, is how journalists cover the convergence between robotics and faith, the future of robotic preachers. And there's a fascinating literature developing on this. And across various faiths, whether it's in Buddhism, Hinduism, of course, Christianity, can robots officiate religious rituals and functions? And along that line, particularly where I grew up around Silicon Valley, the emergence of transhumanism as kind of the role of artificial intelligence in faith. And I've already seen articles on Mormon transhumanists, you name it. I haven't seen anything on Muslim transhumanists just yet, but that's what I find as fascinating. So kind of to make a pitch for EGI next year. And my module, you'll get, again, pandemics, but also then the artificial intelligence, robotics, technology, and faith.
Thank you. So we have another question. If you had to give a grade for accurate religious coverage from mainstream media outlets, what would that grade be? And also for mainstream media outlets, do you think it's important to have religious journalists on staff, or is it enough to have journalists to try to learn about religion to be better reporters?
I guess it depends. What religion are you talking about? So you see, if I had to give a grade on mainstream media religion during the rise of ISIS, I would give it a C minus. No, that would pass. D. It would get a D in terms of coverage then. So I think it depends on what religion and what time period we're talking about. It's come a long way in terms of reporting on Islam, I can say, but with the rise of ISIS, there was definitely a, let's say, decline in religious literacy.
Megan or Julie?
What was the second part of your question again?
Also, for mainstream media outlets, do you think it's important to have religious journalists on staff, or is it enough to have journalists just try to learn more about religion to be better reporters?
Yeah, I do think that newsrooms should have journalists who are personally religious. I don't think that it's a qualification at all to report on religion, but I think that it really helps to think of diversity in a separate term that includes religious philosophy or ideology even to a certain extent, because it would greater reflect the population, at least in the US. But yeah, I think it's hard to have a grade for coverage of religion. I would say like a solid B. I think there's a lot of religion journalists in the US I really admire a lot, and they do a really good job, especially in breaking news. So it's almost like there's so many other problems we could have, regarding reporting on religion. And I do see very often stories that I don't completely agree with the way that they framed the story, but the basic story in the news is there, and they found it and they broke it. So that's great.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with what Megan just said about a solid B. It's hard to evaluate it all because there have been some not great stories, but there's been some really great stuff, like this whole communion thing in the Eucharist. I think it was Elizabeth Diaz who had a great piece in the New York Times trying to explain it's about God. I think that was her subhead. It's about God, actually. And that was really great. I mean, to see that in the secular paper. As far as the question of having religious reporters on staff, I think, like Megan said, it's important to know about religion. I think you have to care about religion. I don't think you can cover it and you don't care. You think it's really weird for anybody to be religious. I don't know that you have to be personally going to church all the time. It probably would be a good thing so that you understand what that does, what that means in the lives of people. But even if you're not super religious, I think you need to care about religion as a factor in people's lives and not be dismissive of it. Because I don't know how you can cover it if you think it's weird and, cultish and all that. So, but But if you are thrown a religion story as a reporter and you're not particularly religious, I would hope that you would want to learn everything you can about that topic like you would anything else. Like say you're thrown a business type story, but you're not really a business reporter. You're going to want to know what the background is and that kind of thing. So you need to bring to religion the same care you bring to other issues as a reporter.
So when I was in college, I did a double major in journalism and theology, Catholic theology. And in my role here at TFAS, I advise my students on their careers. If you had to give any advice to a college student who's getting ready to enter the workforce, when it comes to additional education regarding religion, or just additional resources, and we mentioned some of these, what would be your advice to young people? And then finally, what would be your advice to some of the veteran journalists who are joining us here today, who may have been at it for a while, who still might be a little skittish? The whole trope about, never discuss politics and religion at the dinner table. You go the opposite when it comes to this. So what would your advice be to young people just starting out, and to maybe some folks who are a little on the older end of the spectrum, who are open to being better at this?
Well, I guess I could go. I guess for those just starting out, I would say, the way journalism is now and with jobs and such, I mean, I don't know if you have a choice necessarily of what you get to cover when you're first starting out. But if you're a general reporter, let's say, I would look for, besides, I certainly would keep in mind religion and find good stories, because there are always good feature stories in some of these social issues like the homeless. I would look to some of the Catholic agencies, and I'm saying Catholic because that's what I do all day, to find out how they're reaching out to the community, and you might discover some really great stories. But you might not have to understand everything that the Catholic Church is about. But just in terms of learning about religions in general, I don't know if you need to take master's courses, but you need to, I think, get some good overall course, a general survey course of religions, so you know what some of the basic tenets are and that sort of thing. And then for veteran journalists, I guess maybe just take some of the stories I know you mentioned something, Joe, about how people might be reticent to cover religion because of the whole don't talk politics or religion. But I guess maybe I would suggest taking some of the stories you do every year, everybody has those, and maybe next time take that and think about, well, who didn't I talk to last time? Maybe I need to talk to the local pastor, near the homeless shelter, and find out what's happening and what they do for folks. I focusing on homeless because it is a big issue, and just kind of rethink how you always do stories. And gee, maybe I could bring in the perspective of a Catholic. It doesn't have to be a priest, but it could be a nun. It could be a lay leader or a young person. I would think about something like that. I might interview this time around for that particular story.
I alluded it to the answer in my giving a grade. If you're young and going into this, as Julie said, courses are important, but also talk to the faith communities that you might be covering and ask them, what often does the media get wrong about us, and how would you like me to address that? That seems to be the most commonsensical. Go to the source, so to speak. And if you're talking about kind of more mature practitioners in the field, I think just read others who, I mean, I gave a couple of examples, like I said, I specifically said these aren't, journals that say that are usually on the religion beat, but they did a good job of making the transition. And I think usually that's always kind of my solution is just read, but there we go again. It's read those who have made the foray and see what you could learn from their experience.
I would tell people to, it depends where you're coming from. If you're in the US, I would say you should definitely wait, graduate college, and then work some before you go to grad school to make sure, explore different areas and see what do you really want to go to school for and just get work experience. But maybe if you're coming from Europe where a master's might be cheaper, opportunities, it's really hard to say anything blanket for anyone. But for veteran reporters on the call, I would say you should pitch us at Religion Unplugged, and we would love to hear from you, and as well as students too, everyone. But that's my advice for veteran reporters.
And I did notice there are a number of students on the seminar today who are doing the TFAS program here in Washington. So thank you, students, for joining us. Yeah, I would definitely encourage all of you to stay in touch with our panelists and to follow them on Twitter and read their works. I think with that, we will go ahead and close things out. And I just want to thank Paul Glatter and our partner with all this and all the staff over these next few days, and Xander and Michelle with the Fund for American Studies. And for everybody around the world, we really have had a global audience in the last 3 days with EJI. And I think that the goal of this project is to be better journalists, to learn and to be open, and to challenge ourselves in a multiplicity of levels. So again, for everybody, whether you joined us just for the day or if you've been with us for the last 3 days, we're grateful that you took the time, and we hope that you will join us in future EJIs. And please, if you have not been to the Fund for American Studies website and you're curious to learn more about us, we're at tfas.org. But Julie, Ibrahim, and Megan, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that everybody has a good day, and we wish you all the best. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.